war did. Dying is usually something that kicks in the adrenaline. So with that, I would like to welcome Rabia Chaudhry, who's a keynote speaker. Rabia is an attorney, a recent Jennings Randolph Senior Fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where she researches the intersection of religion, violent extremism, and countering violent extremism, and an International Security Fellow with New America. She's the founder of the Safe Nation Collaborative, a CVE training firm which works on two fronts, providing counter-violence extremism and cultural competency training to law enforcement, correctional and homeland security officials, and providing national security and CVE training to Muslim communities and institutions. So before Rabia gets on the stage, one of the questions I was asked when I wanted to invite Rabia for this conference was, well, how does she really relate to cyber? And this is something that I really want us to think about today as we listen to different speakers and afterwards when the students leave and they go and do their competitions. Cyber and cybersecurity are not just about technology, right? When institutions get hacked and when data gets breached, it's not just about the malware. It's about the people that it impacts and the policy decisions that have to be made after that. So without further ado, let's invite Rabia.
Good morning, CSI, CyberSeed. It's a real pleasure to be here this morning, and thank you so much for that introduction. I want to talk to you briefly about the background of my work, because as you heard, cybersecurity doesn't appear anywhere in that bio, but I'll explain why it's important to me and why I'm here to talk to you. I am an attorney. I'm a licensed attorney, and I spent the bulk of my career practicing federal immigration and civil rights law. After that, I began working in national security, specifically in a CVE context. Does anybody know what CVE stands for? I literally think it's like 10 people in DC. It's countering violent extremism. And even though it's not 10 people in DC, it does get billions of dollars of funding, and it's a big concern to national security folks all over the world, not just the United States. And then, just in the last 4 or 5 years, I have begun working in the field of criminal justice, totally inadvertently, without meaning to, and I'll explain how that happened too. So the trajectory of my career has really led me to work in fields that I didn't expect, but there is a common thread that really connects all my work, and that is advocacy. And I know for a lot of folks, the idea of advocacy, the word advocacy is kind of like this vague, like what does that mean, right? Is it just me sharing stuff on Facebook? I'm now an advocate, an activist. It's a little bit more than that. There's many different definitions of advocacy, and one formal definition is it's any action that speaks in favor of, recommends, argues for a cause, supports or defends, or pleads on behalf of others. But its simplest sense, in the sense that I think about it, is that it just means caring about an issue and doing some form of public work that impacts that issue. So throughout my career, I don't just work in these fields. I have been an advocate on these issues, meaning I didn't just practice immigration and civil rights law. I advocated on issues that impacted the people involved in those spheres. And these are issues that I can't escape because they are constantly impacting my family, my friends, my community. And my advocacy has looked like a lot of different things. A lot of writing. I've written dozens, if not, I don't know, maybe at least 100 different op-eds, articles, essays. I wrote a book last year. I've done a lot of social media campaigns, crowdfunding, or fundraising online, and of course a lot of public speaking to lots of diverse audiences. I've done a lot of law enforcement training, speaking at churches and senior citizen centers, universities, schools, and of course conferences like this one today. And I'm going to be honest. There's not a tremendous amount I know about cybersecurity in a technical sense. Like I can't even install malware on my machines. I really can't. And I saw that one of the sessions after mine is called Using Stylometry to Attribute Programmers and Writers. I don't even know what that could possibly mean. But I'm here to talk about why your work impacts my work. Because all of your work does impact advocacy work. It impacts the work. It impacts the people on behalf that I do the work, especially when it comes to two specific issues inside cybersecurity, which is data integrity and privacy issues. And I'm going to start with one very specific example. And this might be, if anybody knows who I am here, this might be the only reason you might know who I am, and that is the podcast Serial. How many people listen to the podcast Serial or know anything about it? Okay, there's a little bit of a hint of a recognition there. So let me explain a little bit about that. Serial was a podcast that broke like every podcast record in the world. It came into existence about 3 years ago, and it was a podcast produced by NPR, or This American Life, beautifully produced 12-part series about a wrongful conviction that took place in 1999. Now, my connection to this podcast is not that I created the podcast. It's that I have known the wrongfully convicted man who's at the center of this podcast since he was about 13 years old, and I've been advocating for him for about almost 19 years now. So 3 or 4 years ago, when I saw that we were about to once again lose another appeal, and again, let me make it clear that when I say advocating for this young man, his name is Adnan Syed, I wasn't his lawyer. I was just a family friend. And my little brother is his best friend since they were kids. So I just knew him as a local kid. But anyhow, fighting his appeals many, many years, we were about to lose yet one more, and I said, it's time to go to the media. So I found this producer who makes podcasts, and I said, would you investigate this case? Sarah Koenig. She ended up winning a Peabody Award for this. She was on Colbert Report, she was on it was spoofed on Saturday Night Live. It became a pop culture sensation. But let me explain a little bit about what happened in Adnan's case. Adnan was in high school when he was arrested for the murder of an ex-girlfriend and classmate in 1999. And one of the pieces of evidence the state used against him was cell phone evidence. Again, 1999, cell phone evidence, it was like maybe the first case in the state of Maryland to ever use this kind of evidence. People didn't understand this technology very well. And what they did was they didn't have any forensics tying him to the crime. They had a very unreliable witness who got a plea deal. And they used that witness's testimony and they lined it up with where Adnan's phone had pinged, the cell towers they had pinged that day, the day that young lady disappeared. So it convicted him. He got life plus 30 years as a sentence. He served, again, he was 17 at the time, he served almost 19 years now. What happened about 2 years ago after Serial came to light, unfortunately, the producers of this podcast made a great podcast, but they didn't find any evidence that would really exonerate him, which was my purpose in approaching them. But a group of investigators and lawyers came together in the wake of this podcast and said, we want to help. And I teamed up with them. We created a new podcast to really deeply investigate and research the case. And one of those lawyers, going through old boxes of files, found a fax cover sheet that was sent from AT&T to the police when they had requested those cell phone records. And the fax cover sheet had one line on it that this lawyer was able to hone in on, and nobody else had noticed, because who reads fax cover sheets? Nobody reads fax cover sheets. And the fax cover sheet said, incoming call data is not reliable for location. Those cell tower pings from 1999 are not reliable to help tell you where that cell phone existed at the time it pinged in. That one line on the fax cover sheet got his conviction overturned last year. He's still in prison because it's in the appellate process, but it was a big deal. How this data was used, if this was caught or even understood back in 1999, he might have had a very different life. Now, after our podcast, Undisclosed, which we did like 40 episodes on Adnan's case, we were approached by all these different innocence projects around the country saying, hey, can you take a look at our case? Can you cover our case, investigate it, report it? And that's how I got involved in criminal justice as an advocate without ever meaning to do that kind of work, because it was hard for us as a team to say, no, sorry, we're not going to help your wrongfully convicted guy. The next case we did was out of Georgia. A young man who at 18 years old was wrongfully convicted, who also had cell phone evidence that helped convict him. But the interesting thing about this case is called the State versus Joey Watkins, was that his cell phone evidence should have exonerated him, because the time that the murder took place, this young man was driving in a mountain range, and his cell phone pinged the one lone tower in between the two mountains. for some reason, in 2001, when the jury heard this information, they didn't understand what that meant. That there is absolutely no way he could have been anywhere but between these two mountains. There's no way a signal could have gotten beyond those mountains. For some reason, the state didn't explain, well, the state didn't want to, they wanted to convict him, but the defense couldn't explain it, the jury didn't understand it. He was convicted, sentenced to life also as a young 18-year-old man. But this information, hopefully, now that we've clarified it and gone back into court, new appeal, will help him get a new chance, at least a new trial if it doesn't exonerate him. But over and over again, in this world of criminal justice, you do see the misuse, the misapplication, completely misunderstanding data, all kinds of data, all kinds of information that comes from different technologies that all of you guys are connected to. A case that I'm currently working on right now involves time cards. This young man was convicted. He's been in prison for 24 years, and he said, well, I was washing dishes at a local Houlihan's, and I clocked in and clocked out in an electronic time machine, you know, the employee machines that they have. And the state's arguing that that data is actually vulnerable to manipulation, so it's not reliable. So you would think, and see, it's interesting to me that the center is called CSI, because it's not at all, it doesn't stand for what CSI normally means to people, right? Crime scene investigation. As somebody who works like in that field, that's what I think of when I think of CSI. But there's a phenomenon in criminal justice called the CSI effect, which has really hurt us in the last 20 odd years that CSI has been on the air, and that's this. That's the utter reliance on data, technology, information, as being the absolute truth that means one thing or another. So people walk into a courtroom as a jury and think, oh, you have tech evidence, it's solid. There's like, it can't be manipulated, it means whatever you're telling me it means. And I used to also be struck by the CSI effect, whether it comes to DNA evidence or other types of things, because I was one of those very naive fools who thought the data is neutral. Data is anything but neutral. Because over the years, as I've represented clients, defendants, and done a lot of community work, what I realized is this, that any set of data depends on the following questions. Why was that data collected? How was it collected? Whose data is collected? Who collects it? How is it stored? When is it shared? Why is it shared? Every one of these decisions in this process of just collecting data, it can be something as simple as a biometric from somebody, a fingerprint, an eye scan. It can be just a very simple collection of data, but a lot of decision makers went into that. And every single step of the way, those decisions can be impacted by human bias. And this is something that the criminal justice system is really discovering now, how this impacts criminal justice and policy that leads to things like mass incarceration. So science has identified 178, I mean that's a lot, 178 unique, distinct cognitive biases that we all are subject to. So the many vital decisions about data and privacy that you will be entrusted to or are entrusted with actually cannot escape those biases. None of us can escape our biases. In other words, we keep developing bigger and better types of data and how to collect it that might seem highly reliable, but the problem is, at the end of the day, we have users that are unreliable, people. Now, this morning in the opening talk, we heard a lot about, I'm terrified, frankly, but anyway, about all the different cyber threats that we face, but most of the time when people think about cybersecurity, they think about threats to corporations, financial institutions, government, institutions like media, elections, or we think about individual privacies, right? Like my personal identity being hacked, my own medical records being stolen, but we don't often think about cybersecurity data privacy issues in the context of social justice. Again, how your work impacts my work. Meaning, how does cybersecurity impact the most particularly vulnerable communities in our society in general? The poor, immigrants, racial and religious minorities, and yes, the incarcerated. Well, I'm going to give you some examples of how these groups of people are impacted by these issues. And sometimes this impact is not intentional. It really isn't. It's just there's a lack of awareness that's even happening. I'm going to talk briefly about Black Lives Matter, and what has happened to them is very similar to other social justice movements and organizations. And you have to think to yourself, there's no financial benefit really here to the folks who are launching cyber attacks against these movements. These are politically and ideologically fueled cyber warfare, basically. But Black Lives Matter has suffered over 100 DDoS attacks. They suffer something else, which is interesting. I've worked a lot in social media advocacy in the social media space when it comes to countering violent extremism and how extremists use the social media space. They suffer from what I call social media chaos, which is the creation of all these fake identities that add into the social media space, ideas, narratives, completely fake news, that undermine movements. It's happened with Jewish Americans, it's happened with Muslims. So you'll have groups of people saying, hey, I'm a Jewish American and I believe this whatever reprehensible idea, and spreading it and spreading it and spreading it. And now you have Jewish American activists who are like, no, wait a minute, that's not an idea that's mainstream in our community. But there's chaos that's caused online that undermines entire communities and movements. So Black Lives Matter has suffered for that. And many times these are, now, interestingly enough, I said I'm an advocate for, in this particular wrongful conviction, Adnan Syed, that's been almost 19 years now. When Serial came out, I started blogging because Serial was telling a great story, but they weren't telling the whole story, and it was irritating me. So I said, I have a blog. I'm going to continue to add to this case and disclose documents. My blog started getting attacks. It was so weird. I said, who is attacking my blog? Is it like the state of Maryland? Is it the prosecutor? Who's doing this? And a company called Custodian, which is a cybersecurity company out of Australia, God bless them, they reached out and they said, we normally protect corporations and like banks, but we want to help you out here because we keep seeing, like you keep saying your blog's been taken down. Because like I said, I can't even install malware. I don't know what to do with it. And for the last 2.5 years, they've been protecting my blog. And they said to me, they'll send me the monthly reports, and they're like, we don't even see banks get attacked the way like your blog gets attacked. And all I'm trying to do is help get one person trying to get one guy out of prison. So imagine like the massive attacks that like larger movements have to face and the kind of resources that they really lack to fight back on those. I want to talk about it's not a wrongful conviction case that we covered on our podcast, but in between wrongful convictions, which take us months and months to investigate, we did a series on Freddie Gray. Everybody remembers Freddie Gray, right? Freddie Gray was killed in Baltimore when he was arrested for basically running away from the police when they were coming after him. They arrested him, put him in the back of a paddy wagon. And the narrative became, now all of the officers involved were acquitted of his death. I don't think anybody can argue that his killing was intentional, negligent probably. But the narrative became that he died in the back of the paddy wagon, that he got a rough ride. And nobody's responsible for that. It's the driver ran some lights and he got a rough ride. So we had a couple of investigative reporters take a close look at this. They spent about a year looking at all the CCTV footage they could possibly find. Now, if you don't know, in Baltimore, I live about an hour away from Baltimore. Freddie lived, grew up, and died in a very poor urban neighborhood. It's a kind of neighborhood where every block has maybe like 3 to 4 CCTV cameras on it. They line every street. Everywhere you turn, there are those cameras. But here's the thing. That footage is not available to people who are under its constant surveillance. Every part of your life, every time you step out of your house, it can be surveyed, but you don't have access to that footage. So in this case, the Baltimore police released certain amounts of CCTV footage during when this all became public and it was a big thing. And our reporters very carefully they had to work really hard to try to get public access to some of the other footage, piece together this footage from different angles, hundreds of different angles of that street, and realized that the footage that the Baltimore Police Department had released had been carefully edited and cut to show that Freddie didn't die in the back. He wasn't injured fatally in the back of a van. His back was broken before they put it in. Now, the question this raises for me is not just why do only the police have access to the video footage, but why do they have access to this data in a way that actually allows them to manipulate it? Why is there no integrity to this data, right? So when you have a case of state abuse, you will see this pattern repeatedly, right? Whether it's a wrongful conviction or wrongful injury or death of a citizen, what you'll see is the authorities having the only access to the data, as well as having the power to alter the data. And on the receiving end, you have the most disenfranchised who have no access to it. You know, I'm doing a lot of work nowadays in Pennsylvania on wrongful convictions. They have very, very difficult public access laws. You can't get access to anything. Body cam footage, which is digital, should be available immediately. Not available to attorneys and defendants. So again, the issue is not just of the integrity of the data, but the access to the data. I want to talk a little bit about the use of data collection, cybersecurity issues when it comes to counterterrorism and immigration. There's a real nexus here. People might not, and I never expected that when I began in practicing immigration law that would eventually develop into national security work, but a lot of counterterrorism policies are created around immigration policies too, because it's one way to control these issues. I mean, we see it even now in the last year or so with the Muslim bans and Syrian refugee issues and trying to do better vetting. But what's happened with immigrants in this context is that there's been lots of mass surveillance that actually has led to almost nothing of American Muslim communities. But beyond that, immigrants when you are an immigrant, meaning like you are applying to come to this country under many, many different ways to come, as a student, as a fiancé, as a business person, entrepreneur, whatever. There's so many different ways. As an asylee, refugee, all of your information is going to be collected repeatedly. Like every 6 months, your biometrics expire. I don't know how a fingerprint expires every 6 months, but it expires. So you have to keep going back over and over again to getting biometrics done and getting security done. But what's happening in the last few years is that social media is also being collected. Social media data is being collected on folks who come and go out of the country who are immigrants, not citizens generally, although there are reports recently of citizens being asked to open their phone and give access to Border Patrol agents to their social media accounts. But if you're specifically an immigrant, then before your applications are even approved, government agents will be looking carefully at your social media and stuff. Now, that begs the question of this. As somebody who's worked in the national security space, somebody who's worked closely with law enforcement, both local, state, and federal, when you ask the FBI, what is the greatest domestic threat to this country, it is not an immigrant who's going to come here and have access to something. It's actually white nationalist groups. It's a rise in white militias and sovereign citizen groups. When you talk about where is your funding going, where is your training money going to protect us from, it's mostly in those areas. So when you're collecting massive amounts of data from people who actually are not posing a big threat, the question is, what gaps are you then leaving open? Right? What gaps are you leaving open? But it also begs the question of, what are you learning? I'll give you an example. I'm from Pakistan, as we say it. But some people might not understand me when I say Pakistan, so I'll Pakistan it up. I was born there, I was raised here. I have family members in Pakistan who, if they ever came here, highly educated people, attorneys and doctors and well-respected people, if they ever wanted to come here, and mostly they don't, but if they ever wanted to come here and their social media accounts were carefully examined, it would be just a series of religious postings. That's all it would be. And that's a very cultural thing. It's a very cultural thing because when you post, here's another religious lecture, here's some text from scripture I liked, it basically makes you look like you're this really great, lofty, spiritual person, right? That's all it is. They're just posing. But if you have a federal agent here looking at this and they're like, religious lecture, religious lecture, religious lecture, religious lecture, religious, how are they going to understand that information? They're going to say, this guy's a religious extremist nut. So the people who are actually looking at this information, trying to understand the information, that has a big impact on, what that ends up looking like, what the outcome is, and what policies are created around that. I mentioned it before that my problem on these issues is the issue of human bias and how biases about poor people, people of color, immigrants, you name it, impacts every decision that goes into your work. And I have to say, while the work of this center and this conference is to me, fundamentally tied to our ability to operate as a free society. Again, whether it's in the national security, I mean, we're talking about military, we're talking about other very, very large institutional concerns. My confession is this, that I'm not here to urge you to think about the implications of your work as it relates to like really lofty notions of liberty and freedom, but because it's personal. This is really personal stuff for me. I am privileged because I'm an educated, upwardly mobile woman. I'm a citizen of this country. I don't have to undergo what a lot of immigrants have to undergo. And by the way, just to be clear, when somebody's an immigrant, they don't just like walk through the border, they're an immigrant, suddenly they're inside the border and they're not an immigrant. You're an immigrant for years. It takes a long time to become a citizen. It takes a long time to become a citizen. But no matter what I cannot escape is that I'm a member of a religious and ethnic minority. I've got 2 daughters who were born here after 9/11. I now have an 8-month-old son, who was a total surprise, but it is what it is. I have a daughter in college. I have a daughter in college, by the way, who's studying cybersecurity, and I wish she could have been here, but she's watching the baby, so it is what it is. So I'm here because most of the decisions you guys are going to make in your careers really have profound, lasting, and sometimes pernicious impacts on people with the least protections in this country. But you do have the power to help create policies that can prevent the misuse, intentional or otherwise, of data by those in power, because you can create mechanisms that will mitigate misuse of the data or actual abuse of the data by doing things like creating equitable access, right? Thinking about, I'm creating this technology, who has access to it, and who doesn't, and why? What's the difference here? And even oversight of that access, right? So let's say, for example, you have in a city, the Baltimore Police Department only has access to this data. Well, who has access to that? Who has oversight to that access? Is it a group of citizens? It's not. It's an absolute access, and there's really not a lot that can be done about it. You have the power to try and make sure that the collection of data is done in the most deliberately and thoughtfully neutral fashion possible, because you can make sure that people have less resources than others, like activists, like social justice advocates, and just individuals who are blogging, maybe, aren't more vulnerable to having their rights infringed, and making sure that a lack of resources is not a reason they don't have access to data and proper cybersecurity. I don't know if in the cybersecurity field there is any thought of like nonprofit cyber work. There must be. That helps movements and organizations and other nonprofits. People who just are not going to have access to be able to hire firms like Custodian and others to help them. But it's necessary. You can help make sure the data is stored in ways that can't be manipulated. How do you create technology that at the end of the day, the data that technology gives you, it can't be altered? Nobody can do anything with it. The integrity is sound. And I really hope that one day we're able to create systems that have transparency and accountability built in. So when there is a lack of integrity in the data, well, there's alarms that go up. There's some accountability for that. It's public information. It's not stuff that nobody ever finds out. And this is also a very important piece of this puzzle, and that is this: to make sure that the people making these kinds of decisions represent the diversity of the populations that will be impacted by these decisions. Now, if what I'm getting at isn't clear, I'll say it a little more plainly. Don't let a group of all white males make decisions that will only impact all black males, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the argument for diversity on this is not that it's just the right thing to do. It's not an affirmative action argument. It's an efficacy one. It's about just doing it better. And I'm going to give you an example that's not related to cybersecurity directly, but it's a real-life example. I am a fellow of an organization called the Truman National Security Project, and they train people on all kinds of aspects of national security. And one of the first conferences I attended, we did an Iran simulation. This was maybe about 5 years ago, about it's a simulated exercise, and a group of people are sitting around a conference table and going through the what ifs in a certain scenario. In this scenario, there's a party in Iran that helps to overthrow the Shah's, the regime, and basically, what would the United States response be in that situation? How do we help these folks? Would we help these folks overthrow it? And what would our intervention be vis-a-vis the nuclear capabilities that Iran has? And I'm listening to folks sit around the table talk about this, and I realized something. Pakistan and Iran, well, I don't even know about Iran. We don't know the full capabilities, but we're pretty sure they can't make a nuclear weapon at this point. Pakistan has nuclear weapons. I think Pakistan is the only Muslim-majority country that actually has nuclear weapons. And I will tell you this. The people of Pakistan would rather starve than give them up. It doesn't matter what government is in place. They don't care if the mullahs are in charge or an army general is in charge, like has been in the past, or their civilian leadership. They don't care. Those nukes are precious to them because they have a huge, huge threat on their border, which is India. And as I listened to this group of people around the table, and I said, what makes you think for a second that regardless of who's in charge in Iran, the people of Iran wouldn't still want their nuclear capabilities? Why wouldn't they want them? You think regime change is going to change that? It's not going to change it. And that gave everybody pause, but I was only able to insert that because I was at the table. Most people around that table didn't look like me. And they had no idea. They had never met a person from Iran. So that is why it's better to have diversity, because you have people there who are able to offer their experience and insights in ways that maybe you just don't know. You just don't understand a lot about what's happening on the other end of those decisions. So the point being, you're going to just produce better products, better policies, and have better outcomes when you have at the table people who bring the broadest range of experience with them. So I want to be clear about something. I'm not here as an anti-government activist. I have worked closely with government. My recent fellowship, USIP, that's a government institution. I have worked with the DHS, Department of Homeland Security. I've worked with the National Counterterror Center. There's a lot of good people doing this work. I'm also, as an immigrant, I see what kind of chaos comes about when you have very weak governmental institutions and weak security institutions, and how, at the end of the day, citizens are not protected when the government can't protect itself. So I believe in strong national security. I believe in the importance of the government being involved on these things, and in fact being on the front lines of many of these issues. But at the same time, I want to remind you that the soul of this nation is grounded in individual rights and protections. So balancing these two interests is really hard work. But it's going to be part of your work, right? Do you give in to government concerns, which sometimes are just unintentionally badly informed? Concerns that don't need to be concerns, but have become concerns for maybe a political reason, versus individual rights. So I want to wrap up by just charging you with a couple of responsibilities. Number one is to be aware of and think deeply about the fact that many vital decisions about data and privacy that you will be entrusted with or are entrusted with cannot escape your own prejudices either. So you have to examine your prejudices. And sometimes that means just understanding the gaps in your own experience, understand them, and also be aware of the blind spots on your teams and institutions. Look around and say, what's missing here? Who's missing here? And the question at the end of the day for me is this: are you guys able to mindfully create systems that mitigate and maybe one day will eliminate the impact of human bias? I think that's a really interesting challenge. How do you take technology and make it, at the end of the day, human-proof, right? I mean, after all, people working in the tech sector, they often troubleshoot when a program doesn't work perfectly. But what about when a system works perfectly, a program works perfectly, but it's used imperfectly by imperfect people? It's used to reach ends that maybe the creator had never envisioned. Think about what is the worst way if you create a system or technology that performs perfectly. Think about what is the worst way this could possibly be used, and how do you prevent it? So finally, I'm just going to say, I hope one day you are able to human-proof cybersecurity, not only to protect it from all the external threats that we heard about early this morning, but also from internal obstacles like the ones that I've mentioned, many of the ones that you aren't even aware of, and I hope you become more mindfully aware of. Thank you.
So now we have time for some questions. Anyone in the crowd wants to ask a question? Ramesh gets tips.
Thanks, Vijay. First of all, I want to thank you for your remarkable speech. And one caveat I would say, as an Iranian American, I can assure you Iranian people don't want the nuclear weapons. So, but coming back to your topic, one thing that really strikes me in terms of data quality, integrity, and custodian of the data, how would you think about even collecting the data or creating the data to begin with? Because some of us make a decision not to engage in Facebook for that very reason. Some of us make a decision not to tweet everything for that very reason. So I think it goes back to also the individual responsibility because of the fact that once the data is created, it can be used and it can be seen from the biased lens that you talked about. So I'd love to kind of get your thoughts on that.
It's hard as somebody who is, I'm not saying that what I said in that space represented what every Iranian person, but capabilities versus a weapon are two different things too. But I will say that it's still better to have more people represented than less in any circumstance, and I do truly believe that, whether it's any of the fields that I've worked in and others. In terms of creating the information, as an attorney, it's all about the Constitution, freedom of speech, right? The First Amendment protects the rights of people to tweet mostly what they want, not everything nowadays, which is probably a good thing, and share on Facebook. I am not comfortable with telling people to limit your output, to limit your expression, because it could be used against you. Because that's what the First Amendment is all about, is to not allow that to happen. So while, yes, I agree, certainly do not share your address and personal phone number and bank accounts, information online. I think most people are fairly careful in how much private information they share online. Maybe it's just my social media feeds, which are mostly about politics and advocacy and social justice issues and not deeply personal stuff. So I think the government's responsibility is that despite maybe its citizens not always making the best citizens and others wanting to come to this country, not always having the best judgment, but not to use that against them. That would be my response to that. Yeah. There's a couple more questions.
I also would like to thank you for your speech. The question here is data integrity. I guess that's the crux of everything. Because only once the data is actually converted to information, that's where the problem occurs. But data in itself is neutral, it's unbiased, it's just there. So data encryption is one method of solving one of those problems. The other issue here is, from a personal identifiable information, is demonetizing the use of personal information. See, that's one of the things that drives the commercial engine for stealing information on that. So just want you to think about that. And for its bias, eliminating bias. A bias is a fundamental aspect of the human condition. So we have to be careful when we say eliminating bias, because you might inadvertently throw out the baby with the bathwater. So.
Yeah. Oh, no, there is absolutely no way to eliminate human bias from humans. But what we have to think about is how do we eliminate the impact of human bias from systems? And that's really what I'm calling people to do, not just in this space, but also in the criminal justice space. When I speak to attorneys and bar associations and law schools to think about these issues, I will say, you said data is neutral, and the issue is data integrity. Why on Freddie Gray's block are there like 15 cameras, whereas my parents who live in a upper middle class suburb of Baltimore, there's not a single camera there. Decisions went into putting cameras in places where people are, don't have maybe the means to fight back, and in certain places there aren't. When I drive through certain neighborhoods, there are many more speed cameras. There are many more speed bumps. And when I drive in other neighborhoods, there aren't. You have many more, these are all decisions. Like that, even capturing that data, we decide what data we want to capture. Like even before we get to getting that data. And that impacts the data. That impacts what kind of data we have. I don't have surveillance of the neighborhoods around the local country club. I just don't. There could be a serial killer out there, but I don't have any surveillance. Because we are not putting cameras up there. So we have to think like one step before that too. At least that's what I believe. So there was another question or comment there?
I guess this is an answer in some respects to a question that you posed earlier, which is, are there nonprofits in the cybersecurity
Yeah.
space? And there are.
Okay.
The one I'm most familiar with is the Tor project that deals with privacy and anonymity for activists and individuals. There's the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which most people think of as legal, but they also have technologists. There's Team Cymru that deals with denial of service attacks, and there's Citizen Lab that deals with social engineering and other malware attacks and things like that. So there are people doing this work, human rights data analysis group and so on. And I think it would be great to see your engagement with those groups.
Well, that's great to know. I have heard of a couple of them. I don't know deeply about their work. I would say most of the advocates I know also don't know deeply about their work. So it might be interesting to bring those kinds of people together to say, hey, these are even resources that actually exist that you might not know about.
Questions?
Yeah, this is more of a comment than a question. I think one of the messages we need to take from Rabia's very good presentation, I want to make a comment on that, is that security is very important. National security is very important, and especially if you look at the news last few days, North Korea, what's going to happen to the US, to the world. But the whole question of security needs to be looked at in the frame of our society's values. And the question is freedom versus security. Okay? There is a trade-off, sometimes a conflict between freedom and security. And while considering that security is all important, we have always to keep that in mind. Okay? It's not a black and white question. It can be a very subtle question, and let's keep that in mind while evaluating all the steps that we look at taking, decide to take.
Thank you. I agree.
So I've got a quick question. So on May 12th, the cybersecurity executive order came out, and one of the things that it talked about is that we need to build a more resilient cybersecurity workforce. And part of doing that is, as you know, and you mentioned this, and the previous speaker mentioned this, that how do we get more people to engage in cybersecurity, and how do we get a diversity of opinions in cybersecurity? So one of the things, is everyone familiar with the Google Manifesto? Has everyone heard about that? So basically an engineer at Google wrote this 10-page document, essentially arguing that there are fundamental differences between men and women, which is why there are not more women in technical fields, and in particular computer science. Right? And this is something that genuinely puzzles me, because some of the foundations of computer science were laid down by Charles Babbage and Ada Lovelace, right? So from very much at the inception of computer science, you've had women involved. There's a lovely book called The Computing Boys Take Over by Nathan Ensmenger from Indiana University, where he actually talks about how women used to dominate the computer science field, and it's been like a systemic thing where women have been kind of moving away from computer science, and there are reasons for that. So I'm kind of curious, why do you think that this falsified notion of, women can't do tech and women can't do computer science, or women can't do computer security, why does this continue to persist? And how can we, go about overcoming it?
So, it's interesting that this idea of gendered behavior and gendered proclivities, it's not obviously just confined to the tech space. What's happening recently in the American Muslim community, and this is like basically a huge scandal for us, but nobody else knows about it outside of us, although I think The Guardian and BBC are reporting on it, was recently there is a very, very charismatic American Muslim religious leader who has recently been outed as somebody who has been behaving very unethically as he's preaching about how to be appropriate with the opposite sex, acting very inappropriately on his DMs with the opposite sex, and coercing women, and just doing all kinds of terrible things he shouldn't be doing. And one of the arguments being made for this guy in defense of him is that he's a guy. It's a man, men behave differently than women. Like, women shouldn't be shocked by this. Women should just defend themselves from this. And so I find the thread of that same argument about certain behavior being, and certain interests and certain whatever, capabilities, whatever you want to say, like these being gendered issues. And I mean, obviously, I think that's nonsense, and I would hope most people know that's nonsense. I can't imagine really any man working in a space, whether it's law or tech or anything else, alongside women and saying, on the inside, this person really is not genetically as capable as I am. I mean, I hope we're beyond that. I just don't know how to respond to that, other than it's utter nonsense, and that, as you explained, that the inception of these fields, the women were integral to them, and they will remain integral to them. My daughter, I said she is studying cybersecurity at GW, George Washington, and she is just one of maybe 3 females in her class. And I don't think it's so much that there aren't young girls and young women who are interested, but that they are being given certain signals that these spaces are not friendly for you. And I think that's the real issue. So then the challenge is, how do, on an institutional level, you change those signals? How do you change the signals?
So I think that's all we have time for. Does anyone have a last question?
Thank you so much, then. Have a great conference.
A couple of quick announcements. Rabia is going to be sitting outside in this room. She's going to be signing her book, Adnan's Story, for the next hour. So in case anyone's interested in that, please go ahead. We have a short coffee break for the next 10 minutes. So, if anyone wants to go get some coffee,